Hi, it's Joe from Mostly Off Topic here, and I'm back with some more GM tips for the One Ring role-playing game. Today I want to talk about encounters, and encounters are out of the three subsystems, combat, journeys and encounters. Encounters are probably the simplest, most straightforward set of rules. Essentially, when the heroes have an encounter, the GM sets the tolerance level, which is the number of failures the NPC will tolerate during the encounter before things go badly for the heroes and the NPC kicks them out of wherever they are. And then the players roll for insight and they gain their bonus dice based on that preliminary roll using insight. And then you set up a scene and the GM kind of role plays the NPC and you test them with various skill tests throughout the scene. That's the idea. If the players succeed, if they pass enough tests and don't exceed the tolerance level, then they get certain narrative or campaign-driven bonuses based on their performance throughout that scene. And that's really the essence of encounters. Very simple compared to the other subsystems. Now, I've been thinking about encounters much more recently and thinking about how they fit into the grand scheme of a campaign, how over time they can be used and not become just another board mechanic that's slightly tired and just grinds the game down. And looking at ways to kind of incorporate good role-playing and mechanics alongside each other in encounters. So let's really break the rules down for encounters and look at the step-by-step process that the GM is supposed to take the players through for every encounter. Step 1. The players as a group set a goal for the encounter. So maybe they want to persuade a village leader that they must flee the village, and that's their goal. Maybe they want to create a new ally in the NPC. Maybe they just want to learn something hidden, and this NPC has all of the information on that thing. The players as a group should have a clear idea of that goal, and hopefully as a GM you've already got an inkling of what that goal is. Once the players have established the goal and articulated that to the GM sets the tolerance level, and that is the number of failures that the NPC will tolerate during the encounter. And that is usually based on wisdom or valor. And depending on what kind of NPC it is, they will favour one over the other. That tolerance level can also be modified by a number of things, and I'm not going to go into detail on all of these because it's in the core book, and the important ones to look at are prejudice. So if the NPC is prejudiced against a culture, so they might not like dwarves, they might not like elves, then the tolerance level will be reduced. The other thing that can modify tolerance level is standing. And generally speaking, low-level PCs who are near the start of their adventurer's career don't even have standing on their list of things to increase and achieve. So standing is probably going to be 0 for fairly low-level PCs. Standing really only becomes important later on in the game. Then the players make their preliminary rolls using insight. The quality of the success determines the number of bonus dice they get to use throughout that encounter. Then there is an introduction phase, and at this point the players introduce their characters to the NPC, and they either do that as a group or they nominate a spokesperson who steps forward and speaks for the group. And the players can use a lore roll. According to the rulebook, they can use lore to determine the best approach. The kind of skills they may use to introduce the group and themselves are awe, courtesy, and riddle. You could probably wangle a couple of others in if you wanted to, and being flexible with the skills is important when you're trying to encourage role play. So the interaction phase happens next, and that is where the NPCs and the player characters have a conversation and discuss whatever it is they're there to discuss. If there's a spokesperson, the other players can still interact, they can still play a role. They will just use more passive skills, like they might use insight or riddle to determine whether the NPC is lying or is hiding something from them. And the active characters, so those involved in the encounter, can use awe, inspire, riddle, persuade, song, courtesy, all of the kind of interaction-based skills that they've got. Once the encounter has come to a close, the GM or the LM starts to determine the outcome based on whether they exceeded the tolerance level and got booted out, or they succeeded and the level of that success, depending on the number of successes that the players rolled throughout the encounter. So there's a little bit of bookkeeping to do for the GM, and the players as a group need to think about how they approach the encounter. So the first thing to think about when we look at encounters is, do you really need one? Not every NPC encounter has to have the subsystem behind it. So I tend to use a tiered approach to NPCs. There will be very low-level NPCs who might have a name, they will have a culture, they might even have a skill or a trait associated with them. But generally speaking, they're just sort of background colour. They're just there to facilitate a bit of a scene and as furniture for the scene, really. Then you've got your kind of middle tier NPCs, and they are NPCs who are going to interact with the PCs but don't really pose any challenges to the PCs, don't have something to hide, or don't give the PCs anything to gain necessarily. They're there to either accompany them on their adventure, to help them with a quest or a side quest, or to basically do some exposition about some story and tell the PCs something about something that's going on in the campaign world. Top tier NPCs are the NPCs like Radagast, Glowin, Thranduil, Beorn, those big named characters that are the kind of figureheads, the names and the faces of Middle-earth that your players are probably there to see. That's ultimately what they want, is to roam the lands of Middle-earth and speak to these mythical characters. And generally speaking, if the players are going to meet a top tier NPC, there's got to be an encounter, from my point of view anyway. So my rule of thumb is, if the players are meeting a top tier NPC, then I will engineer an encounter. And then there's got to be a couple of other factors involved, but that's usually how I approach it. So a couple of contributing factors to having an encounter with a significant NPC. Firstly, the players have got to have a goal in mind. There's got to be a reason for them meeting that NPC. It could just be that they want to meet this amazing character. They would just want to meet Gandalf. Well, that's fair enough. They get an audience with Gandalf, but what's at stake? They have the potential, by meeting Gandalf, they have the potential to create an incredibly powerful ally. Possibly a patron, someone who will start to feed them quests and task them with things. So there's a potential outcome, and that could be at stake. So if they get that encounter wrong, Gandalf decides they're not worth the effort, they're not going to be able to help him, and he chooses not to be their patron. So from the outset, think about what's at stake, what they stand to gain from meeting that NPC, and what they stand to lose if it goes wrong. The second thing I'd say about engineering an encounter with a significant NPC is think about the skill test that you're going to give your players. Otherwise, it runs the risk of being really a bit of a duck shoot, in that they will just end up using courtesy, song, riddle, maybe insight to just rack up some successes and get some advancement points. So you want to be testing them. You want to be making the implications of failure important. So if they do fail, then it matters. And think about the breadth of skills that you can test them on. So they may have put a load of points into courtesy because they know they're going to be interacting with NPCs along the way. Maybe you want to test them with awe or inspire or persuade, and get them to use skills that they don't have as many points in and that they don't usually rely on to get them through encounters. There are ways of bringing in other skills. So awareness could be very important. Maybe there is a tick that the NPC has and they keep fidgeting, and without passing that test they wouldn't be aware of that. Maybe that means that they're hiding something. Search, you could also use search to search the NPC's face and look in their eyes for something hidden, something meaningful. And you might also ask them to pass a lore test at some point. These are all valid skills that you can throw at the players to test them and make the encounter a bit more challenging and a bit more meaningful, and ultimately more rewarding for them if they do pass it. Bolted onto that, I'd say make the target numbers challenging for them and make them relevant to the situation. A NPC that they're coming out cold with, they might want to build an alliance with, let's say, the elves, and the elves aren't necessarily open to being allied with. They're quite insular, so the target numbers are going to be higher for that. So bump up the target numbers and test them on skills that they don't expect to use. Another tip for running an encounter in the One Ring: let the spotlight do its thing. So this is your chance as a GM to really do your research into characters and do a lot of studying of those big named NPCs, and think about how you want to characterize them in that scene and just bring weight to the moment. Don't worry too much about doing silly voices or props or, wearing a hat or something like that. Just focus on the lore. There's some great sources. Obviously, you've got Tolkien himself, everything he wrote about these incredible characters. There's the Tolkien Gateway wiki. There's a load of stuff you can read up. For example, we recently had an encounter with Thranduil, the Elven King, in the Woodland Realm, and this was a really big moment for the players. They were really keen to meet him. They had some information for him, and it felt like the time to do a big, significant encounter, a big scene. So lots of scene setting. I did a lot of description of the halls of the Elven King, and really kind of built up to that moment that they got to meet the Elven King. And when they did, everyone was expecting the encounter. People around the table were saying, right, we're going to have an encounter now, so we need to roll some preliminary dice and all of those kind of things. Additionally, when I role played it, I was referring to the fall of Gil-galad and at the hand of Sauron, and the way that his spear Aeglos danced between him and his foes. So Thranduil seemed to me like he was quite hung up on the death of this amazing elven king Gil-galad, and still wasn't quite over it. And because he's such an ancient being, he's been in Middle-earth for thousands of years, the passing of time is different for him, and maybe the fall of Gil-galad is still quite fresh for him. So I brought a lot of that into the scene, and had very wistful, poetic moments of Thranduil wandering into a corner to reflect on the death of Gil-galad. And ultimately, it all folded in to bring life to this character. So the spotlight was on me as the GM to set the scene, set the tone. And then when it came to testing the players, I would let them have their moment. And the other players were respectful enough to give the spotlight to that player. So it's really important that you, as the GM, allow that to happen and that you encourage it around your table. Lastly, I'd say if the roles and the rules are getting in the way of the actual role playing and the scene itself, then just ditch it. Forget about the tolerance level, forget about the target numbers and skill tests. Just focus on what the conversation is about, what the meaning of that conversation is, and what the outcome is probably going to be, and let the storytelling take over. Encounters can be a really good way to bring structure to those big moments of meeting big characters, but if it's getting in the way of just a good session of the One Ring role-playing game, just get rid. And that's it on encounters from me. If you've got any thoughts on encounters, any experiences that you have with running encounters or even playing them, leave a comment. It'd be great to hear what your thoughts are. And thanks for all your support on the channel. We've had some really nice feedback from people, so thank you very much, and see you next time.